I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Okay, so just to remind you where we've gotten so far with Federalist 10, which deals with the form of government that the United States has, and particularly with how to prevent violent factions of the majority from gaining power and ruining the democracy, which I think is a fairly timely topic right now for us to remember what the American founders had to say about this. This was written by James Madison to persuade people to adopt the U.S. Constitution, which we now still have. And he's just gotten done saying that there's two big differences between democracies, meaning pure democracies where everybody votes, every citizen votes for every issue, and republics. And he says the first one is the delegation of government in the republic to a smaller number of citizens. So that's representation instead of direct democracy. And secondly, he says the greater number of citizens and the greater sphere of the country over which the latter may be extended, meaning that with representational government, you can have a much larger territory, right, over which the government can extend, because you don't have to get everybody in this larger group to this larger nation together. Only their representatives have to come together and deliberate. So he's going to go more now into the issues having to do with the republic. And so he says the effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So here Madison is saying that a big benefit of the Republican form of government, which can be more extensive, is that it sends representatives to the legislature instead of every citizen. And that means supposedly, and I guess hopefully, that the representatives will be of a higher caliber of knowledge and of wisdom than the average person. So they're sort of like counting on the people to be able to recognize talent and wisdom when they see it and vote for that, and then send those people to the legislature. It was kind of like a filter, right? And even though the people might not know how to make the best decisions on every single complex issue, they do know, according to Madison, how to pick leaders who are, in a way, like more knowledgeable than themselves on average. So that's one advantage. And he says, under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. So by this, he means that it's likely that the representatives of the people will actually make better decisions for the good of the people than the people themselves. Okay, now we might not everybody is going to like the tone of that, but that is exactly what Madison and other founders thought, was that the smaller number of people, call them what you will, would have a better knowledge of everything involved, and so would be able to make better decisions for the people than the people could possibly make for themselves if they all had to collectively make all the decisions. Can you imagine if all the American citizens had to collectively make all the decisions? Well, you can imagine now, hopefully you can see why they thought this was a good idea. Okay, then he says, on the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Okay, so here's the dark side, right? Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, of sinister designs, may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. Okay, let's break this down. If you read this yourself, I mean, first time I read this as a student, I took American political thought, both, I believe I took some of it at the undergrad, but then I took it at the grad level. And I read this sentence and I'm like, whoa, I need to break this one down. But this is of extreme importance. Men of factious tempers, okay? Men who are prone to creating factions, in other words, the type of factions that cause trouble. Men of the type that cause local prejudices, that can't think about the common good, but only their local interest, whether that be geographical or whether that be like related to an industry or business, but their own prejudices. Men who have sinister designs, meaning they are not planning for the common good, but plotting to do something that will harm the people. Those type of men may, by intrigue, meaning secret machinations, secret going around, plotting and scheming behind the scenes, by corruption, meaning using money and power to influence and coerce other people to do what you want, and in an immoral way, of course, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages, first obtain the votes of the people by basically lying to them and by corruption, and then betray the interests of the people. So first get their votes and then not do what's in their interest, but only in the interests of the men who got elected. This is the problem that can arise in a representative system. And of course, off and on, we've seen this happen throughout pretty much our entire American history. The representatives, whether it's the president or the people in Congress, sometimes they're not the best of caliber, but they fooled people into thinking they were. And before you think that this means that the people are just stupid, that's not the case. Okay, the people don't have that much time to think about their representatives. They're busy working and paying attention to all the rest of life that equals our ability to live and live well, or at least strive to. And they only have so much time to spend figuring out who to vote for and paying attention to all these different things that they would need to make a truly always correct decision. So it is possible to fool people. And we have seen so many examples of this in history. And then the people get into power and they are corrupt to begin with, or they become corrupt, and then they abuse the people and their rights. Okay, so he's saying, he realizes this. It can be not the wise people, although that is what he intends and wants, but it could also be that the people get fooled and we get bad representation. Then he says, the question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal. And so the question here is whether small or large republics are better for the first scenario. Are we more likely to get good representatives if we have a larger than a smaller republic? Now, here we're talking about comparing small and large republics, not pure democracies and republics, okay? So should we have, in other words, a more extensive republic on the hopes that it will produce better representatives overall and be less prone to these kind of vile, types that basically prey upon people. And he says it is clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. So he thinks the larger republic, the larger territory that the nation represents, okay, the less likely it is that you're going to get these types of men of factious tempers. Okay, he's not saying it's impossible. He's saying it's less likely. So why? All right. So he says, first, in the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of the few, and that, however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. So here he's talking about, how many representatives are necessary to try to guard against the quote cabals of the few, meaning corruption, backdoor deals and stuff. Okay, not ruling in the interests of the people. And he's saying if you have a small republic, you really have to guard against cabals, dealings behind the scene, because if you have just a few representatives, it's way too easy for them, kind of like your city commission or county board, if it's small, to just have a cup of coffee with each other and come up with a plan for your city or your, and so you'd want to have enough people in that representative legislative body in a small republic to make it less likely that they could do that. So with a larger number of people and, other people who aren't buddies with these folks would have a real incentive to watch what they're doing and to point it out and to check the corruption. Okay. So even in a small republic, you have to do that. If you're going to have a small one, you need to have a bigger legislative body. But then the other thing is, though, if you have a larger republic, or if any representative body gets too large, then you've got the confusion of a multitude again. What is that magic number, where you've got enough people that they can watch each other and check each other's bad behavior, but not so big that it becomes just a mob again and they can't really decide anything, right? And by the way, in a mob of people, too large a number, corruption can be just ignored, right? Or not seen, I should say. There's too many balls to keep an eye on, so to speak. All right. So hence, he says, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents and being proportionally greater in a small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. So here Madison is pointing out that the proportion of so-called fit representatives, those who really, kind of deserve to be representatives, maybe because their character and their wisdom is evident, is going to be about the same regardless of whether you have like a small or a large republic. It's going to be about the same. Just for the sake of imagination, let's say it's like 10% of the population. And so in a small republic, the fact that you have to make a bigger representative body than you might think just so that people can keep an eye on each other, you're probably going to have to, elect outside of that proportional a number. So you're going to have more of a chance that that legislature is going to be infected, so to speak, by some corrupt characters. Whereas in a large republic, supposedly, the legislative body is going to be smaller. It's still going to be a lot of people, but it's going to be smaller. This is almost like math, smaller than like the size of the small republic in proportion to its population. And therefore, somehow the people are more likely to elect those who are of good character and wise. He says there is a greater probability of a fit choice. And this stands to reason that same 10% that the people have to choose from, so to speak, right, that tend to rise to the occasion are going to equal a much greater number of people within a large republic that are likely to filter upward and be recognized as worthy of, running for election and being elected. I don't know if I totally agree with his reasoning here. It's a decent argument, but this may be part of where we went wrong or could go wrong. But I think he's making the best case he can for a large republic. All right. Then Madison says, in the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. And the suffrages of the people, being more free, will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. So that sentence kind of helps explain the paragraph above too. Again, the votes of the people will be more free because they have more good choices, and they will be more likely to focus on men who possess the most attractive merits and the best of characters. With more people looking and examining their choices, in our case, our various districts, we are more likely to filter out the unworthy candidates. We have a lot of choices, in other words, and we'll be able to recognize the top ones. Whereas in a smaller republic, we might have fewer choices, and therefore it might be a little bit more difficult. He says, it must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean, a sort of medium or, balanced position, right? There is a mean on both sides of which inconveniences will be found to lie, okay? If you go too large, you've got a problem. If you go too small, you have a problem. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests. If the districts or, boundaries of the voting area are too large, then the representatives that are elected may not know all the things going on in the various areas of these very large territories that they represent. So that can be a pitfall. And then he says, as by reducing it too much, reducing the territory too much, you render him unduly attached to these and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. So if their district is too small, you also have a problem because that person may be too attached to one particular local area to really be able to rise to the occasion of thinking about the common good and the national interest. So the size of the district, the size of the territory that a representative inhabits and represents is really important to James Madison. He says the federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interests being referred to the national and the local and particular to the state legislatures. So here he, for the first time, really gets specific about the federal nature of the Constitution and the fact that within this national, government, we are still going to have these states, and there will be power sharing between them. And the states will have the smaller districts within them, and their state legislatures will, of course, represent only the people in that state. The legislatures will represent people in various parts of the state that do have various and diverse interests. And so what can be handled at the state level should be handled at the state level in this scheme, particularly those things that are of, quote, local and particular nature to the state legislatures, right? That, a state like, Nebraska, for instance, which has a lot of farming and beef production, right? A lot of what they do in this regard, farming and particularly beef production, maybe that's something that best belongs to the states to legislate on and regulate and so on, right? And not the federal government. But a lot of things that Madison and others were concerned with were more likely to be well dealt with at that federal level. So the national government can handle some things, and the state legislatures can handle other things, and the local and particular things belong more to the state legislatures. And so this helps with creating that balance or that mean. Then he says, the other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. So here we're back to the idea that Madison really championed, that this great extent of the federal government, the United States government, would be suppressive of cabals, as he says earlier, that it would be harder for such a government to be taken over by a faction of the majority or any faction, because within it there would be so many interests and so many ways of life represented in the legislature. And of course, Madison thought that, and the founders generally thought, that while there needed to be division of powers and checks and balances, the legislature should be the final say or the most important voice of the people, even on matters of war, which that has been completely overtaken by our executive branch. But that's not what they wanted. So, this was where he put a lot of hope in the expansiveness, which would lead to so much diversity of interest and ways of life and commercial behavior that there'd be no way, or, well, there could be a way, but like less of a way for such a strong opinionated majority to ever come together and basically, quote, execute their plans of oppression. So then he says, extend the sphere, make it bigger, and you take in a great variety of parties and interests, and you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. All right. So here he is saying, if we make it bigger and we take in all these diverse interests and they're all represented, you will make it less possible for this factious majority to actually even form and to want to invade the rights of other citizens. And even if it does kind of form, if the common motive of the factious majority exists, it's going to be harder for them to actually figure out how to come together and act in unison, because literally they are so far apart. Now, what we need to remember is that, not only literally that they're so far apart, but also that they have all these other things that can divide them. But anyway, what we do need to remember is that back when Madison was writing, it was difficult to travel 5 miles. All right. And they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have the internet, and they didn't have a whole lot of things that make it far more easy for people to, in our society now, to have like a very opinionated, zealous, I guess, motive to come to the fore and kind of capture the minds and imaginations of a great deal of people rather quickly. So I think this is an element, not the only element, but I think this is an element that Madison and the crew could not have possibly anticipated, and that may make the probabilities, as he put them, greater that a factious majority can indeed break through and implement its schemes of oppression against the rights of other citizens. And I'll just finish with this, and then we've got one more session on Federalist 10 next time. He says, besides other impediments, other things that get in the way of oppression, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. So again, he's saying that if there are a large number of representatives, and not to mention just a large number of people being represented, that evil intentions that are voiced are more likely to be checked, that is, to be argued against publicly, to be opposed publicly. The more people there are involved, the more likely that's going to happen. That's all he's saying there. And I think we are seeing that, that of course happens. We're famously in an echo chamber, right? So if anything, also our electronic means of communication have amplified that. But apparently, we have a situation where Madison, who is only hoping through probabilities, may have been maybe not surprised given the circumstances, but dismayed to see that a factious majority has indeed been able to get through some of these barriers that the U.S. Constitution was designed to create. All right, so next time we will finish up with the last 3 paragraphs, and then we'll kind of reflect on Federalist 10 as a whole. And then I plan to move on to Federalist 51. Please do join the Maurin Academy, support us on Patreon. I will put the link in the notes below. We have 3 tiers now, one of which is at the $1 level that gets you into 2 of our reading groups. You can also follow everything that we put out into the public on Patreon. And then we have a tier where you can get some things live, such as our monthly check-ins, and you can get all of our content recorded. And then we have another level that's called a Worker Scholar, where you can get everything we do, both live and recorded. We have an event coming up. Eugene McCarraher will be giving a talk on the enchantments of Mammon and Techne. So check that out, and everything else we do on our website, pmaurin.org, MAURIN, pmaurin.org. Thanks.